If everyone could come in and start taking your seats, we'll get started with our last plenary for the 2021 dialogue. Alex will invite you up. People in the foyer getting your coffee or water. Come on in. All right, thanks,
Alex. Thanks again, everyone, for a pretty phenomenal couple days. Just one more plenary session to go. I'm particularly excited about this one. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our panel on Can You Build Fast and Just?
Hello, everyone. Our ability to slash emissions and prepare for the rising risks of climate change are going to depend on reconciling two pretty contradictory facts. One is we need to rapidly build a tremendous amount of stuff, and we are terrible at rapidly building a tremendous amount of stuff. In California, we've managed to spend a half a century not building a speed train from San Francisco to LA. It can easily take a decade to build a transmission line on the rare occasion when we build a transmission line at all. And in just the next 9 years, we're going to have to expand our high voltage transmission capacity by about 60% if we want to be on track to zero out emissions by mid-century. We're going to have to grow our wind and solar capacity about fourfold over that time, and we're going to have to add millions and millions of EV charging stations. On top of all that, we need to just radically overhaul our physical infrastructure. We're going to have to raise our rail lines. We are going to have to build out city cooling centers. We're going to have to expand and enlarge our sewage and water systems. We're going to have to erect seawalls, all to prepare for make our cities more resilient against the rising dangers of climate change. While we're doing all of that, we also have to some way figure out how to learn from and not repeat the tragic injustices of the past that have been inherent in our building patterns, where we've disproportionately located economic benefits and essential services in richer areas and polluting infrastructure, factories, power plants, extraction sites in poorer areas and in and around areas, communities of color. Up until now, in many ways, we've excluded some crucial voices on these issues and largely allowed the debate over planning to be dominated by often rich property owners who have prioritized property values and views and parking over issues like density and transit and affordable housing and other public goods. So one way or another, we have to figure out how to build fast but build fair. We have to more equitably distribute the benefits, the downsides, and the climate adaptation protections. And so we're very fortunate today to have a trio of speakers who are going to share their thinking on how this might be done. With any luck, we'll finally solve this problem here on stage today. No pressure. And we are going to start with short presentations from each of the speakers, so I'll ask you all to unmute your Zooms now. We're going to start with Armond Cohen, who is coming in remotely. He is the Executive Director of the Clean Air Task Force. Please take away, Armond.
Good afternoon. I've been asked to sort of set the stage with a few visuals about what this infrastructure build out really means for the United States as an example. And I'm going to start with some slides from Princeton Net Zero America Project, which is an excellent piece of work, which takes some of the models which tend to build a lot of renewable energy and a lot of thermal energy too, but and walk you through what the landscape impacts look like from a high level. Let's start with where we are in 2020. The blue dots are existing wind projects. The tiny little orange dots are solar projects in operation today. As we go forward in time, more wind, more solar in 2030. In 2040, we begin to see quite a bit more wind in the upper plains through Texas and the West. And the solar build, you can see those orange dots are getting much bigger. And then by 2050, we've industrialized a significant part of the US landscape. you can see the blue and orange has moved quite substantially, and a lot of offshore wind in the Northeast. Again, in terms of reality on the ground, we're talking about a lot of kit, some of it built very close to human settlement. We're not talking about very small installations. We're talking about industrial scale deployment of wind and solar in these kinds of scenarios. A lot of transmission required to connect it, and Princeton looked at that issue too. This is where we are today, the transmission system in 2020 in gray. Over time, we need to connect a lot more of that to move the wind and solar energy around. By 2030, we're at a 61% increase over current levels. By 2045, we're doubling the size of the transmission system. And by 2050, we've tripled the size of the transmission system. And anyone who's done transmission will be able to tell you that that's way out of scale with historic experience. Now, these images I've just shown you assume a lot of thermal energy is still on the grid, like nuclear, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, to balance the wind and solar, in addition to a whole lot of battery storage and other kinds of storage. But there's a lot of thermal infrastructure that needs to be built too to make all that happen. This is a picture of the CO2 storage, trunk lines, and facilities needed around the country to provide that thermal energy and fuel production. We also, in the Princeton model, we see a goodly amount of thermal energy placed around the landscape. Those turquoise, green, and triangles are the zero carbon energy sources that balance the grid. Now, what does that look like? We've seen recently a study from Vibrant Clean Energy, Chris Clack's group, looking at the deployment of this large amount of renewable kit in California. The red will show you, in theory, where all that PV should go. The green is wind. In practice, though, there are many limitations, legal and otherwise, on where all this can go. This is a map that draws on data from the Nature Conservancy, looking at what's actually available in California to deploy PV. Green is the areas that are legally protected, just simply off limits. Blue are the areas that are administratively protected. The yellow areas are areas of high conservation value. Gray is areas that simply aren't available due to techno-economic, geographic reasons. And then finally, you're left with the red areas, which is about 5 million acres out of 105 million total in the state. So notwithstanding in theory, in practice, actually building stuff is pretty challenging in terms of the theoretically available space. If you downscale, as we did to Fresno County recently, just to see what this looks like at the county level, same analysis would end up giving you only the red areas to build in, which is a fraction of the total land available in the county. And this is what it would look like notionally. Those purple areas are the PV, and you see the blue connecting transmission. This is a substantial amount of transmission to be built in the county, 4 large double circuit 500 kV lines, about 110,000 acres of large PV projects, and in addition, about 116 miles of generation ties, smaller transmission lines that connect those purple PV installations to the transmission trunk lines. This is not a non-trivial task. There are 550 landowners that would have to agree to this build out. Unfortunately, many of those landowners are sitting on high value cropland, pistachios, almonds, and the like, which is kind of lifeblood of the economics of that particular county. And so there are already restrictions in place that would limit this development. Just zooming up in California, this is a map of recent ordinances and opposition to large-scale solar and wind. These range from outright bans to restrictions on setbacks or restrictions on, for example, use of solar that doesn't serve local demand. Again, it's not just California where we're seeing this opposition. These are pictures from the upper Midwest and from the Northwest. We can get into the demographics of this opposition later. Now, those of you who've attended breakthrough dialogues in the past on this topic know that there are some alternative routes here that might have lower land impact. This is a recent study just showing what the different landscape impact is in terms of amount of kilowatt hours produced per unit of or the amount of land required per unit of energy produced. And on the left, you see nuclear just barely registers. PV is 2 orders of magnitude higher than nuclear in terms of land impact, and wind another order of magnitude higher than that. So while in theory, power density is a very attractive concept, this is the same kind of data displayed for the Eastern US. And in this case, we sort of have a cartoon of what would be required to serve all electric demand and all zero carbon hydrogen production through various modes of energy. And the big red box is onshore wind, big blue box is offshore wind, the orange is solar PV, and the green would be nuclear or something similar like gas with carbon capture. And as you can see, there are very, very significant differences in land requirements to serve that amount of energy. Same holds looking at Japan. By the way, these images are from our colleagues at Lucid Catalyst, a firm that we work with that's done this work all over the world. You can see that with the orange PV build and the magenta offshore build compared to using an advanced heat source like nuclear or carbon capture on gas, substantial difference in land requirements. Now, that's all great in theory. We could say, let's build power dense forms and let's moderate the amount of renewables build. But in fact, we know that building nuclear or carbon capture is not a walk in the park either, as you see from these protest pictures. So I guess my conclusion is there are obstacles and dragons everywhere, and I'll leave it to the rest of my panelists, co-panelists, to solve that problem. Thanks a lot.
Small order there. Thank you, Armond. Next up, we have Clarence Edwards. He is the Legislative Director at the Friends Committee on National Legislation.
Promise I'm not up here checking my emails. These are my notes. It's really nice to be here at Breakthrough from the imperial capital, as I like to call Washington, D.C. So it sometimes feels like what it might have been like in ancient Rome toward the middle to end. No, I didn't mean that. Being here today with you all after 6 months of doing things on Zoom, and I told one of your colleagues at Breakthrough, and I got the email, I was looking for the Zoom link. I was like, yeah, I can do this. And then I scrolled further, I was like, oh, it's in person. I'm absolutely going to that. But it brings to mind David Byrne in the Talking Heads when he said, when they sang, how did I get here? I come to this issue of climate change from a career, just to give you some background about why you're listening to me. I come here from a career that is focused on public policy, strategic communications, on international public policy issues. Quick story, when I was a delegate for the Australian government in my previous job, I was at the World Bank for the annual meetings, and I was sitting next to a delegate from Pacific Island nation, and he got up and said, climate change is an existential threat to my country, and he was talking about sea level rise, and I just thought, I have to get involved in that issue. It's like, it's the issue of our time. So that was about 3 years ago, so I guess I've been successful in getting into it. In my current job at FCNL, just the lobbying arm of the Quaker Church, my program advocates for carbon pricing, clean energy tax incentives, and environmental justice. We believe that climate change is an issue that is beyond partisan politics, and it's more about our responsibility as human beings to protect this planet. So when I think about the question, can you build fast and just? I think that we can, but there are a few things that we have to consider, at least from the Washington, D.C. policy perspective. I think we've made a good start in Washington, D.C. I say we, I'm just an observer, but the Biden administration's approach has conveyed a sense of urgency. There's a $1 trillion, billions are really small these days, it's nothing. $1 trillion infrastructure bill, 550 billion of it is new money, and it has 73 billion for electrical grid, a little bit less for EVs and lead pipe replacement. So that's a good start. We have another good start with this $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation that is going to be considered next week, and the infrastructure bill is going to be voted on Saturday. So these are good down payments, but they're only down payments. It's just a fraction of what we need to do. Also, there's a more inclusive approach with this administration and in general, engaging the environmental justice community. I don't worry about to be frank, I don't worry about the EJ community being an impediment to, if we want to build fast, it's not the EJ community that is concerned about holding up the process. A lot of EJ groups, local groups, have been struggling for years just to be heard, just to hear their concerns heard. And there's a lot of support in minority and disenfranchised communities in general. African Americans at 57%, Hispanics and Latinos at 69% are much more likely to be concerned or alarmed about global warming. White Americans are more likely to be doubtful or dismissive than minority groups. Minorities want this energy transition to be fast and just. I have to say, it's not minority groups that are complaining about the view from their beach homes being blocked by wind power. The impediment to building fast and just, I think, is not the minority communities, but it's the political foot-dragging and gamesmanship in Washington. And unfortunately, climate is still treated like an issue that is just a political football. It's another thing to position on. It's not treated like the existential challenge that it is. So what we have to do if we want to build fast and just is pay attention to the political institutions of this country. The political institutions, the challenge to building fast and just is political institutions that are to a certain extent victims of state capture. Citizens United is a great example of one of the impediments to maybe building fast and just. We have a fossil fuel industry that has gamed the system because the system is thus. And so I worry about our governing institutions in terms of their ability to respond. Like I said, they're responding now, but it's slow. I worry about government institutions that are brittle. After 30 years of governments and politicians saying that, as Ronald Reagan said 40 years ago, government is not a solution to our problem, government is the problem. We're living with the legacy of that. And you can't have a small, underfunded federal government and want to build anything in this country because it's the government that's going to lead. It's the only player that has the capacity and bandwidth to lead. But we have to stop starving it. We can build fast and just, but we have to invest in these institutions. We have to talk about addressing climate in a way that we also have to talk about climate in a way that brings more people in. It has to be inclusive. And we have to paint a vision of the future for people where they feel like they are a part of it. And related to that, we have to build up trust in our government institutions and in our society. You may have noticed that trust in this country is in every institution, whether it's governments, definitely churches. I mean, we're a faith-based organization. You know, we don't have a lot of street cred with people as well for a lot of reasons in terms of the faith community. We have to restore faith in our institutions. And if we have faith in our institutions, then we can build fast and we can build in a just manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Clarence. Finally, we have Jenna Lacocco, a policy analyst at ClearPath.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the Breakthrough Institute for having me here today. As James said, my name is Jenna Lococo, and I'm with ClearPath. We are a nonprofit based in DC who advocates for policy to reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. And my background is a little unique for an environmentalist, as previously I spent 5 years working in the oil and gas industry on major capital energy projects around the world. And most recently, I was located in Georgetown, Guyana, on the team trying to get approvals and permits for the first offshore developments there. And if you don't know where Guyana is, it's located in South America. It's one of the poorest countries there. They have some of the highest electricity rates, and they were about to go through this incredible energy transformation. So it was really eye-opening to see just how challenging it is to build projects of this scale and how you balance that with the concerns and needs of local communities and a diverse set of stakeholders. So it's clear that we need to transition to a clean energy economy. And to get there, this is going to be the largest continental construction project in history. And all of these projects will start with a permit. But the permitting process in the US is not known for its speed. And right now, it is procedurally impossible to achieve our decarbonization goals under the current system. Over the decades since the US enacted environmental reviews, the process has become costly and ineffective, slowing down progress and becoming a tool to delay or kill projects without necessarily providing a better outcome for the environment. The process has been misused to block development and investment in these critical projects and oftentimes results in endless amounts of litigation. The most impactful and important projects are the ones the process slows the most, and delays to these projects means stalls in access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy, and also impacts economic development and grid resiliency. And just as important as that physical piece of paper license to operate is the social license to operate, which is the perception and opinions of local stakeholders with regards to a project. This is something that has to be earned and maintained. And if a project doesn't have legitimacy, credibility, or trust with the community, this can also result in delays and cancellations. The way some projects have historically been sited and built out have disadvantaged certain communities who may bear the brunt of higher air and water pollution, which has created a lack of trust in energy projects. Future projects and policy must address this to help provide cleaner air and water for these communities, as well as more accessible and affordable energy. And separate from that, an attitude of NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, has presented a challenge to projects. People are really interested in clean energy, just not necessarily when it's right next door. And unlike opposition to fossil fuels, which has been driven by concerns over contamination and pollution, opposition to clean energy has largely been driven by property value and aesthetics. So reforming the permitting process is essential if we are to make this transition. And there are a number of legislative proposals out there, some of them included in the infrastructure package Clarence mentioned, that aim to streamline the permitting process. And they focus on some simple changes that could help speed up the process and scale energy. These are things like expediting review timelines so projects get to a yes, or more importantly, a no faster, reducing the amount of paperwork that's required for approval, and clarifying and coordinating government roles and duties when conducting reviews. But if we are to truly build faster and more just, we need to think bigger while keeping affordability in mind. The transition to a clean energy economy is going to require transformational changes to our planning, siting, and permitting processes. Recently, a bipartisan group of policymakers, think tanks, experts, and academics was convened by the Aspen Institute, and they generated a report called Building Cleaner Faster that recommended some critical paths to success. They suggested things like accelerating approvals for clean energy projects with well-understood impacts and benefits, accelerating legal judgments for permitting disputes to enable quicker review and certainty, and state and local conformity with the federal process to ensure fast and certain permitting and adjudication. And there are some other things we should think about as well. How do we prioritize clean energy projects? Projects that significantly reduce emissions should be at the top of the list for government review. How can we encourage siting of projects in areas that have minimal environmental impact but will provide significant economic benefit, such as using a decommissioned fossil fuel site as a location for a future clean energy project? How can we apply programmatic approaches to planning, siting, and permitting that could benefit communities as well as timelines? And lastly, we need to focus on shifting these projects as a burden on communities to an opportunity and create ways for communities to raise their hands for these projects so that we can ensure all communities benefit from clean, reliable, and affordable energy. Coordinated, early, and meaningful engagement with the public and other stakeholders is essential. And the key point to remember as we think through this issue is that we need to maintain environmental stewardship and the public's opportunity to be involved. The need to act is urgent, but we can only reduce CO2 emissions as fast as we are able to permit the projects to do so. So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion today, and maybe we'll solve this issue right now. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I want to start by sketching out the problem a bit more. Armond, why is our approvals process so broken today? Why does it take the US so much longer and cost so much more to build than some similarly dense European nations?
I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that we're a lot worse. Recently, Germany has slowed down considerably in its ability to get wind online. So in fact, there's been a dramatic fall off on onshore wind siting for some of the same reasons that we've mentioned here. The landscape's getting saturated with wind. There's a lot of opposition even to replacing existing wind turbines with new wind turbines. So I think it's going to be a problem throughout the crowded West. Not clear how this plays out in the developing world. But look, the problem is not too hard to understand. We've got a very litigation-friendly system. And we have coalitions of people that come together to block things. And this is always the case, right? When you have broad social benefit, but the burdens are concentrated in a few defined constituencies. So for example, recently in the state of Maine, there's been a transmission line that's been trying to be built to connect Canadian hydropower into New England that would actually be able to balance a lot of the variable solar and wind. It's now gone through 3 states unsuccessfully and is now the subject of a referendum in Maine. It was really a coalition of the fossil fuel interests that wanted to not have power coming in and displacing their gas plants, second homeowners, and the major environmental groups, as well as what I'll call, and this is a point that I think Clarence alluded to, what I would call more the Trump voters, who are not all that interested in climate or clean energy, and maybe they see their landscape as the last thing that they have. So in the literature, this is called the Baptist and Bootlegger Coalition, like in Prohibition, where both the two parties actually benefited from outlawing booze. The Baptists, who for religious reasons, and the bootleggers because it raised the price of their product. So I think it's really complex. I don't think we understand this very well. And in terms of the build out that I showed, we talk about more traditional environmental justice communities, but most of that's going to be built in Trump country. And remember, Biden won 500 counties out of 3,000, but guess where most of this clean energy infrastructure is going to go? So that's an interesting culture war potential problem. So anyway, I think it's the combination of a number of interests that feel threatened, combined with a very litigation-friendly system that Jenna described, that kind of has us in this gridlock. And I would agree that I would disagree slightly with Jenna. I don't think permitting reform is going to be either successful or is going to be enough. I think we have to. I'm more with Clarence, which is I think we have to think about fundamental institutional reform in some way to get a legitimacy over what we're trying to accomplish here.
Thank you for that. Clarence, what are your thoughts on that? How do you even start to go about achieving something like that?
I think that it's interesting what the point about Trump country, and I think that we have to have a dialogue in this country with people that we really don't agree with. I mean, and I get it. I'm a little bit tired of hearing about the disaffection of some group. I understand it, and I listen, but part of the Quaker faith says that it's really important to listen, we have to bring, and I'll just name conservatives in general, Trump voters. You can't have an energy transition with half a country. It's just fundamentally just not going to happen. So what do? We have to have a dialogue. We have to sit and have, whether it's Breakthrough or other organizations or FCNL, we have to start having those conversations. I'm working at FCNL to start having those conversations. It's tough. I have people who are like, I don't believe in environmental justice, or I don't like the term. They're like, whatever, call it a ham sandwich, but let's have a conversation. It's just, let's find that dialogue, because I feel like it's a fundamental impediment to everything that everyone in this room and online wants to achieve.
Okay. Jenna, I kind of thought we might be halfway into the conversation before we were reforming NEPA. But I'm curious about your thoughts on, you mentioned sort of an array of changes that could potentially happen. I'm kind of curious, do you think we're talking about surgical changes that could be made that could really make a big difference here while preserving the spirit of this? Or are you thinking it's more broad, like really broad reform? And I'm kind of curious if you, are there particular things that you think would be most effective here?
I think it's both. I certainly think accelerating timelines is absolutely essential, and creating targets for that. But there's proposals out there currently. There's been proposals every administration for decades now, and a lot of them haven't stuck. And I think one of the critical pieces missing is taking a look at the disadvantaged communities, as well as how do we incentivize the clean energy projects. I think the perception with some communities is that when we talk about reforming NEPA, that's just a handout to the fossil fuel industry. Mm-hmm. But I recently read this report that most projects that are going through the environmental assessment or environmental impact statement process are renewable energy projects. So by not taking a look at permitting reform, we're disadvantaging those projects that could have a significant clean energy benefit. But I do think how we approach planning and siting, and how we can transition projects from being viewed as a burden to an opportunity, is going to be essential to actually see meaningful change.
Okay.
And I'll just add, that's where inclusion comes in. Instead of seeing these projects as a burden, if you engage communities and have a conversation with them about what they need or what they may want, or socialize the project with them, that's going to be, that's helpful.
Yeah. Is there a fundamental conflict between, on the one hand, trying to streamline these processes, and on the other hand, trying to make sure that we're including more voices and a broader array of voices, or crucial voices that have largely been left out?
I don't think so, because I see it as like you can expand the process to include more voices, and that's super general, but like FERC is opening an office basically for environmental justice. That's one example. You could include more voices and streamline the process. It's complex, I get it, but I think widening and then focusing is, if that makes sense, that's the way to go.
Yeah.
But including those extra voices will help remove some of the impediments down the road.
Mm-hmm. Armond, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so James, I agree with Clarence's point that the going a little bit more bottom up on this rather than top down is the way to go. An example would be one that Jenna raised, which is we've got hundreds of existing coal plant sites in the country that are either stranded now or are going to be stranded within the next 10 to 15 years. A logical thing to do would be to give resources to those communities to decide what they want to replace that existing energy. And that can be an inclusive process. Likewise, one could imagine regional planning processes that engage a broad group of stakeholders. And I think what's important, maybe it's the dirty secret here, is money. That we may just have to pay people a lot more to do this stuff. Maybe these clean energy systems aren't as cheap as we think, because we may actually need to compensate very handsomely communities that are affected, and maybe that's in the form of direct cash, or maybe it's in the form of investment in broadband infrastructure or other ancillary benefits. But that's the kind of thing that would emerge in the kind of process that Clarence is describing. At the end of the day, though, someone does have to make a decision, and not everyone is going to agree. So you kind of need a pyramid process that starts very broad with as much legitimacy from the bottom up as possible, but then ultimately funnels to a decision. And that ain't easy to figure out how to do.
I think in some ways you might assume that transitioning from a sort of more polluting fossil-oriented energy system to a clean energy system eliminates some of the environmental downside and health risk issues. But we saw in Australia in recent days a battery plant catch on fire. In most scenarios we're looking at, we're talking about more CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines. And so it's not like all of these things are not going to sort of fall away just because we're moving toward a less carbon intensive energy system and transportation system. Clarence, can you talk a little bit about what the different considerations that could come into play here when we're talking about the downsides to these sorts of projects that we're going to have to be building on huge scales in the coming decades?
Yeah, I noticed a battery fire in Australia, and was talking to friends of mine about their whole dynamic and approach. There are challenges with offshore wind or with solar, but I feel, and not speaking for the entire EJ community, but I think that a lot of communities that are struggling with like the millions of deaths that come from fine particulate matter, fossil fuel pollution in general, a renewable energy economy is miles better than that. Sure, if there are going to be challenges with solar and wind, but those challenges compared to what people have been dealing with for the past since the hydrocarbon economy started are much more manageable.
Yeah.
I don't want to say we can figure that out when we get there, but I think that that's a little bit easier than dealing with fossil fuel production and pollution and landfills and degraded mine sites.
And Jenna, I mean, ClearPath, for instance, is an advocate of carbon capture systems, existing or advanced nuclear, which still is going to have waste issues, and so pumped hydro, which of course has a variety of environmental drawbacks. So I'm kind of curious how you think project developers for these sorts of sets of technologies should be thinking about how they're having these conversations, how they're considering where they will and won't put these sorts of assets.
Yeah, I mean, stakeholder engagement, like I mentioned, is absolutely critical. And speaking as a former project developer, it doesn't start the day you submit your application, it starts years in advance.
Yeah.
But with carbon capture and nuclear, obviously Armond showed us the huge land benefit that comes with that. Talking about potential downsides of renewable energy, if there's communities that are currently based on a fossil fuel industry that are now transitioning, what is the jobs impact of that? So as we think where these facilities should be sited, like Armond and I mentioned, can we use decommissioned brownfield sites? One really great example, in Wyoming, a decommissioned or soon to be decommissioned coal plant, Terra Power is going to build an advanced nuclear reactor there. Wyoming currently gets 90% of their power generation from fossil fuels. So obviously that community is dependent on that coal site, but has a lot of existing skill set that can be leveraged for the nuclear industry, as well as that site itself having existing infrastructure. So we're talking about minimal environmental impact, significant economic benefit. I think that's a great example of how we should go about planning and siting these projects going forward.
Yeah. James, if I can jump in,
Please.
One of the ideas I want to challenge here is, or get us thinking about, is that part of the problem may be that we live in a project by project piecemeal world, where every project sort of sits on its own bottom and a developer proposes something and then opposition or support, or you build a coalition or you don't. And developers manage to deal with that better and worse. But I kind of wonder whether this whole project by project paradigm is going to work. There's always going to be an argument that it belongs somewhere else or there's some better alternative. And projects are not really cited in the context of a plan.
Yeah.
And a regional plan, much less a national plan, or even a county plan in some cases. So, I kind of wonder, I don't know exactly how to do this, but I think we have to get to the point with the scale of the kind of stuff I showed on the screen, that doesn't happen, I don't think, piecemeal, case by case,
Yeah.
chess piece by chess piece. I think it's going to have to be something else that has legitimacy, but has kind of geographic breadth, where the stakeholders are satisfied that they're getting what they want and it's towards some common good. Right now, the narrative for any developer is, okay, here comes another guy, slick guy, who's going to make a profit off my community. And, and he's citing it here because we're weak, or he thinks he can roll over us. But if there is some sort of sense of public good or broader public system into which this project fits, I wonder if we would have a better chance. And the other disruptive idea I throw on the table is, the World War II analogy is used a lot, as is TVA. Maybe we have to think about publicly built infrastructure, publicly built and owned infrastructure. And a good example of that is the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority, which really did manage recently to get approval of a very large line, albeit intrastate in New Mexico, and it ultimately will be turned over to a private operator, but it was publicly developed and financed. So I wonder if we need a very different model than this kind of whack-a-mole, case-by-case, project-by-project paradigm that we're living in.
Right, which gets us back to the challenge of faith in government and allowing, rather than project developers to be working on an individual basis, regional planners and government staff to be doing, figuring out how the pieces need to fit together on these sorts of things, or what the development envelope looks like in which developers can build. Clarence, what are your thoughts on how we get closer to a system like that, which is quite different from how we're doing it right now?
I was just thinking, I like the analogy of World War II, because that's the kind of scale and mindset that we need. And I was also thinking the phrase industrial policy popped into my head. And the free market is great, and I really mean that, but we've got to have some sort of joined up approach on this that cuts through that dynamic and that red tape. We just need to do it in a different way. And yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there some lessons, positive and negative, we can learn and draw on from when America did build big things, from the new era public works era, from highways aren't the best example in this context, but the massive highway build-outs in the 50s and 60s. Jenna, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. I can say that there's lessons learned, both good and bad, from the oil and gas industry, especially working in developing countries. I think on the good side, it was mentioned in the last panel by James, like when you go into a community, don't just assume they want a green space. You have to ask, what do they want? So Armond has mentioned, how do we incentivize communities to want these projects there? And that's where the engagement is really important. Don't just assume a health facility is beneficial or an education facility. Maybe they just want a soccer field for their kids to play at. So as we're thinking about how do we create those incentives, having locals as part of your socioeconomic team and building those relationships is critical. On the con side, I think transparency is something that absolutely has to get better. When I was in Guyana, something that I saw as a challenge was the transparency with procurement processes. So everybody was really interested in, how do I get a job? There's a lot of associated infrastructure that's needed to support an industry. It's not necessarily just the energy project, but hotels and food for the workers and construction equipment. But transparency with how people get selected for contracts, how you apply for a job, that is absolutely essential, so that social license to operate is given by the community.
Right.
And could I just add that one of the lessons from the past, from the 40s and 50s, that one of the downside lessons is, here's why inclusion is important.
Yeah.
We're going to spend billions of dollars over the next few years tearing down highways that went through black and brown communities.
Yeah.
The last time we did massive infrastructure. So we can learn that lesson from the past. And also we can learn the lesson of, Federal Housing Authority emanated out of a program that basically created redlining in neighborhoods and communities. So the other lesson we can learn is, once again, include people in these conversations and decisions so that we don't have to the next generation or 100 years from now, we're not having the next generation of environmental justice advocates who have to undo what we've done in the next 20, 30 years.
Right. Armond, did you have any thoughts to add on?
Yeah, well, James, you know, the World War II analogy is often bandied about, so I actually picked up a book on that topic a while back called Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman, and he has some wonderful anecdotes in there about, for example, right up the way from where you are right now, the Richmond shipyard was conceived in December 1940. The first site survey to look at the building out the platform was in December of 1940, and the first bulldozer sank into the mud, and they realized they had to build a completely artificial, extension, bringing in, millions of tons of gravel, and they did that. And 4 months later, you had a fully functioning shipyard, turning out about 2,000 Liberty ships a year. So, that's fast, right? That's World War II speed. And, we're not too far off from that in terms of pace at which we have to go. So I think we have to stretch our imaginations a little bit. The highway analogy is interesting. If you read up on that too, it was pretty messy. There wasn't a single architect of that. It was a negotiated process. There were broad outlines laid, but there was a lot of choice made by states about where things went specifically, and routing. And so you could imagine some kind of federal state process that had, frankly, gobs of money being spent to incent states and compensate communities. So we don't have to repeat the World War II experience or the National Highway experience, but again, at the end of the day, there still is lots of stuff, and some people aren't going to like it. We have to be careful of these World War II mobilization analogies for the reasons mentioned, but at the same time, it is kind of that level of speed and effort that's required here.
Right. The example, to hone in on kind of a specific example that I think is very representative of the what we need to accomplish and why it's so challenging is the one I think about a lot and I've written about a lot. It's transmission. We know, every model shows, all the research shows that the more tightly integrated a grid we build, the more long distance, high voltage lines we add, the more we can, take the rich resources, wind in the Great Plains, sun in the Southwest, connect them to the major demand centers across the nation. That, it drives down costs, it increases the grid's ability to use a higher share of renewables. It incentivizes additional development because those developers now have customers. But people don't like these big wires and towers running through their backyard or ruining their views of desert and mountain scenery, and which I can commiserate with to some degree, and because often the actual economic benefits in electricity itself is going to some far off community, not the one necessarily where the lines are going through. And so this has been this sort of perpetual challenge to get these things built. There are some things in the infrastructure bill that could address parts of this. Clarence, can I ask your thoughts on what's in there and how far that could potentially help us?
Yeah, it's like 73 billion, and so like I said, it's a good start, but it's not enough. And I was saying to you earlier, I hadn't given the grid any thought at all in my life until starting this job, and I'm on the verge of going down a rabbit hole with reading about the grid because it's actually fascinating to me now, which I never thought I'd say. It makes me think about what are the alternatives to building it out like that. Are smaller grids, is a regional grid, an improved regional grid better? Are microgrids for certain communities feasible? I don't know, but it just seems like the big build out of the grid, which I think could get bipartisan support, I think it does have bipartisan support, maybe we need to think of alternate ways to do that.
Okay. Jenna, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is where the regional planning is really important. Like you mentioned, usually you're delivering the power from one part of the country to another, and they're crossing states. And currently, FERC doesn't have the authority if it crosses different states. The states have the authority, so a state that's just a pass-through tends to kill the project because they don't see benefit. So I think how we approach that is that needs to change. I think the infrastructure package includes some giving FERC the authority to, if a state is delaying or killing a project, to rectify that. I don't know that that's gonna necessarily change the litigation behavior in this country, because at the end of the day, if you're still impacting or disadvantaging a community, I don't know that that solves that issue, but I think it's a start.
Yeah, I just wrote about it this week. They'll get that right in what's designated as like a high priority corridor, which there's only 2 of so far. So there's also this like DOE needs to designate more of those.
And I think I read there was an amendment to the infrastructure bill to sort of strip that out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard that is likely to come under pressure in the days ahead.
Yeah.
Right,
So,
right. James,
please.
if I can weigh in on transmission specifically, Clarence raises a good analytic point, which is how much of the long distance transmission could you avoid by going local? It's just worth noting that in the Princeton model, which I showed you a downscaled visualization of it to a county level, that already assumes an enormous amount of distributed energy on solar on rooftops. I mean, just like multiples of what we have right now. So that's kind of already baked in. I don't, given the value proposition of the long distance transmission line is the variation in wind and solar conditions across the country at any given time. So there's probably no avoiding. I mean, if you really want to build a highly renewable system, which of course is a choice, you could go more heavily on thermal, but then that's unpopular. You would need a lot less of those trunk lines because you wouldn't be balancing the weather across the lower 48. But there is, to a certain point, we can push the distributed model to avoid some of that kit, but there's going to be a limit to that. We're going to be, this month, we're releasing a report with the Niskanen Center, which again, provocatively puts on the table the idea of a national transmission organization that would actually do the planning for a national grid. It wouldn't be sort of driven by a sort of private sector initiated series of projects, but rather would have an overall arching plan that would then be, the details of which would be developed with states and obviously the stakeholders and so forth. But at the end of the day, there would be a single authority that was responsible for delivering the infrastructure. Again, I don't know exactly how it's going to land politically, but we're sort of calling the question, on this issue of do we have a national energy system or do we not? Do we have a national goal or do we not? Yeah. And, again, you might say that's an extreme, but I wonder if we have to be thinking that far out of the box for something like this.
I can't remember if I said it at the beginning. We're going to do Q&A in about 3 minutes, so please start thinking up your questions. And I think Alex or someone else will be walking around with microphones, so just raise your hands or point in their general direction when we get there. Maybe this is a crude tool, but whether within transmission policy or within NEPA reform, is it at all feasible? Is it at all a good idea to just add a climate exemption? Like, if a project is going to deliver X gigawatts of clean electricity, if it's going to deliver X gigawatts, can that just go through, to the degree it's going to deliver that clear public benefit, can it just go through a different set of reviews or no review or whatever? Jenna, is that crazy, or is there something potentially to it?
So that Aspen Institute report that I mentioned, Building Cleaner Faster, that is one of their recommendations. Okay. So for certain types of projects, so removing X amount of CO2, delivering X amount of power, or the location of the project, so decommissioned coal site, previous military base, that they would get immediate approval. Mm-hmm. That's something we have not tested yet, so hard to see if that's going to have appetite outside of that group. And a lot of that is based on the upfront public engagement, because I do think that is the sticking point with all of this, that even if a project has clear environmental benefits, a community could still perceive something differently, and obviously we wouldn't want that project to be killed. So I certainly think it's a good idea. I just think we need to test it more.
Right. Clarence, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not actually, but I can imagine. I can imagine some groups that would absolutely not be down with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, immediately.
Too broad a stroke, or too.
Yeah, too broad a stroke, and yeah. I don't think it is. I think it's actually an interesting and forward-looking idea. But I can already see some of the opposition that would come from it.
Sure. Armond, any thoughts?
Yeah,
there?
James, I mean, I think without taking a position on the merits of that, just a factual point. I don't have numbers at my fingertips, but of course, to trigger NEPA, you have to have a federal nexus, which means going through federal lands or requiring some kind of federal permit. I don't know what percentage of total projects require that, but my guess is it's probably less than 50% of what we have to build has that nexus. If you talk to any developer, I think what they would say is that the federal permitting laws aren't their primary problem. It's mostly state and local siting issues. And that goes back to Jenna's point that the absolute minimum price of entry should be an inclusive engagement process with the communities. So, just as a starting point, but there's lots of other stuff that can be done. As many people know, New York has actually gone so far now as to essentially, New York is now the siting agency for renewable energy, and localities can have input, but it's time limited, and ultimately the state decides. So that's kind of a more extreme version, but that's recognizing that the real issue is really state, county, and local authority.
Got it. We have hit the end of our free-flowing discussion time. So yeah, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
We'll start back here. We'll ask you to tell us your name before your question.
Hi, my name is Judy Moore, and I had a question about the role of technology in all of this. So there is a startup in New Zealand that actually got approval from the second largest power distributor in New Zealand to test wireless transmission of electricity, sort of the newest iteration of the Tesla coil. Maybe it makes sense for us to invest in research that allows us to transmit large amounts of power over long distances without copper coils. So what role does technology play in terms of being able to accomplish this?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I mean, ClearPath, we focus on innovation. R&D and innovation is absolutely crucial. I think all options should be on the table at this point. Looking at the scale of the maps that Armond show us, we've got to put everything out there. So I haven't heard of this specific project, but certainly an interesting concept. And that's why federal R&D, it needs to be a crucial part of all of this.
Yeah, and James, we're down with that. Clearly, techno fixes are good. We support a lot of R&D in that space. Another innovation that's sort of been around for a while, but I hope really gets picked up is superconducting transmission, which reduces the number of linear miles that you need because there's so much more capacity can run through. There's undergrounding transmission, which we can do. The state of California's or PG&E is now committed to doing a lot of it. Right. It'll increase the cost of your clean energy by 3x, but it still is doable. And then finally, there's reusing existing corridors, transmission corridors, or building within them, or highways, rail corridors, and things like that. So yeah, absolutely technology for sure, but there's probably a lot we can do within the existing envelope if we're clever and are willing to spend the money. Right.
And in California, it's not necessarily exclusively about approving these things. It's about reducing wildfire risk in that scenario.
Right.
Hi, I'm Seaver Wang. I'm at Breakthrough on the energy team. My question is similar to something that Judy just alluded to with copper requirements for transmission, which is that the clean energy transition is not just going to be about building a lot of infrastructure, but also sourcing a lot of materials to build that infrastructure. And so my question is, how do we mine fast and just? Because transmission is maybe unpopular, but perhaps not nearly as unpopular as a mine, as a copper mine or a rare earth mine. And there's also all the associated, and it's not just mining, but also processing, manufacturing facilities. So how do we make sure that there aren't sort of other bottlenecks in this clean energy build out? So how do we mine fast and just? I'll pose that question.
Any resource extraction specialists on the panel here?
Actually, I'm not a specialist on it, but I used to work for Global Witness and focused on natural resource management in developing countries. And I mean, this is a geopolitical issue, so it's going to have domestic implications, but it's going to really reverberate globally. I think Bolivia is the #1 lithium mining country, Bolivia and Peru. And so when I hear that, I think to myself, it's going to have these reverberations globally, and this renewable energy transition is going to shift the geopolitical dynamic. And I don't know where that's going, but that's what comes to my mind.
It's very early days, but you've probably heard of companies like Cobalt Metals, which are, there are a couple startups now that are trying to figure out ways using technology to more accurately analyze potential mine sites in the hopes that you don't go digging up areas that don't end up being profitably mineable areas. And so broadly speaking, the goal there is to be able to ensure that when you are mining, you're at least you're doing so in a more efficient way. It's going to be, which leads to less waste overall, and hopefully, again, remains to be seen. They at least are making the point that it could address some of the ethical issues surrounding these things as well. We'll have a story on it in MIT Tech Review soon. Looks like.
Hi, so I'm going to bring a really sort of just pragmatic permitting approach in California. I think it's been now close to 25 years we've been messing around with high-speed rail. It's nowhere on the horizon, and this high electricity scenario that California has cooked up, I think requires something that's in the article I wrote, but something like the equivalent of 30 high-speed rails a year for 30 years.
Wow.
It's simply ludicrous. It's simply ludicrous. And we're talking about increasing the built environment of California with the high electricity scenario by something like 25%. And we fight over blades of grass in an abandoned golf course. So, so for me, this is a classic example of like the government and taxi medallions, which was really a bad idea. And the idea that we're going to do wind and solar and batteries and come up with anything that actually works is absolutely on par, from my perspective, with the government managing taxi medallions. There simply is no possibility that that will work, certainly on anything like the time frame that the climate models demand. So I think we need to get out of technology selection, advocacy, and into a little bit broader eco-modernism, welcoming of technology solutions that are different. And by the way, could be hybrid and maybe 90% fossil fuel free. But if that is a more realistic scenario, and I have no idea whether it is because I'm a philosophy major, but that is a hell of a lot more effective for the climate than pretending we're going to build high-speed rail times 30 in just one state. And by the way, where's the rest of the world going to get enough cobalt or silica or whatever? So honestly, I view this whole discussion of a high electricity scenario in California as fraudulent. It is globally fraudulent. It is ridiculously expensive. It is absolutely not feasible at scale in California, and it rips off the rest of the world. And I wish everyone who's involved in that would live in my world for just a second and also deal with environmental justice from the perspective of people alive today. Because while people are playing around thinking we're going to convert cropland, where people need food, to solar and wind, I mean, come on.
I'll just say California shouldn't feel too bad, because when I was growing up in the 80s in Baltimore, the big deal was we were going to have maglev trains. Magnetic levitating trains between Baltimore and Washington. You get from Baltimore to Washington in 30 minutes or so. That was 1984. There was an article in the paper about a month ago in the Washington Post that said, we're going to build maglev trains between Baltimore and Washington, and you'll get there in 25 minutes or so. And so, yeah, I mean, what?
Right. Hey, James, can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo. It's a little bit weird. I think one way to sort of ground truth the debate of the point that was just raised, I think the kinds of visualizations I showed you are not widely understood yet. And if we're talking about a publicly inclusive process that looks at burdens and benefits, my sense is as that kind of information comes out, we will have more of a discussion about what's real. And I hate to be the pro-nuclear guy on the dais, and since nuclear is outlawed in California, again, people will have to deal with those trade-offs. Like if you want no carbon, but you also want to spare the land, you might have to do some negotiation. But I think right now people can avoid that issue by pretending that the stuff is kind of all small scale and can kind of go somewhere in someone else's backyard where no one's going to notice. And that's just not the case.
All right, 30 seconds. Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
So this is a great panel, and we know the permitting process is broken. And the phrase which I didn't hear enough was reform. So we can complain about why there's not a reform coalition in politics in America today. It's really disappointing. But I'd like to offer a moment of concrete fantasy for the panel. You're all experts. Your choice of legislative leaders, they take you into a back room in the Capitol and they say, we trust your expertise. We're going to write a bill. You write it. We'll pass it. Give me one good idea that goes into your proposal for permit reform.
Oh, until you narrowed it down to permit reform, I was going to say carbon pricing, because I have to advocate on that. I don't have a good answer.
I'll go, because I've been thinking a lot about this.
Thank you.
And building off of what James asked me, I mean, it's not perfect, but you gave me one solution. So accelerated approvals for clean energy projects, and clean being technology inclusive.
Yeah. James, I would say I'm going to fight with the premise of the question, because as I said earlier, I think permitting reform, absent this larger planning context, is going to be a brick wall. But if I had to pick one idea, it probably would be some kind of expedited process and a lot of incentives for the redevelopment of existing fossil sites, because of these are communities typically that are pretty used, at least in rural America, are used to having large amounts of kit around them. There's tax base, there's employment, and all of that. So that's a smaller idea, but it's about the only one that I could think of that really begins to do, that's really feasible.
Great.
I'll piggyback on that one. Let's do a community-led ground-up process where it brings in people at the beginning of the process and starts from the communities up instead of top-down.
Great. I think that gets us to time. So thank you all for attending. Thanks very much to all the panelists for being here. Really appreciate it. Really fun conversation.